Yoke Ling, thank you so much for speaking to us. You've been at these talks now, you've attended these talks now for a number of years. Can you give us a sense of how you feel they're going here in Durban?
Well, frankly, I don't think it's going too well. What we were hoping that Durban will do is that we will have the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which means a new set of targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions adopted here. At the same time, the other piece, the other legal piece, is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which people tend to forget is actually a legally binding treaty. So we have these two legally binding treaties, and the work program under the convention is what we call the Bali Action Plan. And under that, we have decisions that should be adopted in Durban. And one very important part is the United States, that's not a party to the Kyoto Protocol, is supposed to have comparable targets so that they can also do their part as a big emitter. And then developing countries agreed in the Bali Action Plan that they will also take on voluntary mitigation actions at home. And this was all agreed to be done. And every year since Bali in 2007, step by step, as we saw in Cancun, developing countries even agreed that those of us who will do mitigation actions at home, like China, India, Brazil, my country, Malaysia, we will do it, and that will contribute to the overall mitigation efforts. And then the promise would be that there will be this fund, and we agreed in Cancun, we set up a fund, and that would help countries to do, very importantly, adaptation as well, not just mitigation, and then to have technology, etc. So all the different pieces. So you add the Bali Action Plan, and together with the Kyoto Protocol second commitment piece, this actually covers really 100% of the world's needed actions. But what we see happening in Durban is that the countries which are parties to the Kyoto Protocol are not showing any sign that they want a second commitment period. Whatever pledges which are out there, we've seen it for the last few years, have not changed. They're too low for what we need for the crisis in global warming. Meanwhile, developing countries actually have been shown to be doing much more. So we have had studies from UNEP, from the Stockholm Environment Institute, that show that if you collect all the mitigation efforts of the last few years, developing countries are doing like up to 57 to 62% of the total mitigation efforts. Meanwhile, a lot of the poorest countries, like in Africa, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South America, who have been suffering major impacts from floods and droughts, they have been having to adapt with so little money from the international community as promised, never came. And so a lot of the adaptation efforts have been self-funded by some of the poorest countries themselves. So there's a lot of frustration here that the grand bargain from 1992, when the treaties were negotiated, of supporting developing countries to get to low carbon, to sustainability, it's not happening. So we're very concerned that, and meanwhile there's a push for a new mandate, but how, and that's really confusing the public. Because we have two legal treaties, we have lots of commitments, agreements, which if we implement all that, we would be already moving so far to deal with climate change. But instead we find that the richest, most capable countries are now saying, oh, the Kyoto Protocol is not enough, China's not doing enough, let's have a new treaty. But looking at the pledges of the developed countries, they're so low. We are moving to a 4 or 5 degree world. And yet they're saying we want a new treaty that's going to be even better. We don't see any political possibility. The United States have said again and again it will not have any of its actions legally bound internationally, frankly. And they can't even get a climate law passed in Congress. So do we trust the United States to actually come in and be part of a better treaty? And you look at Japan, Canada, the EU, the pledges are so low collectively. Are we going to get a new treaty with really serious targets? We don't believe that. So instead of throwing away the existing legal treaties, we want to see them implemented.
But what's the value of an existing legal treaty if nobody abides by it in reality?
Well, actually, the interesting thing is people are abiding by it. The Kyoto Protocol has actually quite strong compliance rules. And that is one of the reasons why there is reluctance, to actually continue to stay in the treaty by some countries. Like Canada has announced it's going to walk away. The Kyoto Protocol sets very strict rules. It has numbers, maybe too low for our concerns in terms of whether they're cutting enough or not. But there are rules. There are accounting rules. There's a compliance system. So if you don't meet your obligations, For example, by the end of 2012, countries that don't meet their targets, it gets carried forward to the next commitment period. So there is a compliance system. It's very rules-based. And because it is a rules-based system, there are some countries who say, well, we don't really want to be, so they know they have to implement. Meanwhile, in the convention, a lot of every year is not just about negotiating a new treaty. I think there's a misunderstanding. Every year, the COP and the different bodies of the convention are looking at how do you set up inventories, how do you deal with adaptation, how do you set up, like all the different funds we need to have. So there's been a lot of implementation work being done, and countries at the national level have been doing a lot, guided by the convention. What we wanted to do in 2007 with the Bali Action Plan was to speed up the implementation, to ensure that there is support from finance and technology, that we can do more and more quickly. So it's not that there's no implementation, it's happening, but we need to do more.
But the US negotiators here have their hands tied by the domestic political situation. Given that, where can we hope for progress?
Well, it would be, we all understand that the US domestic politics is making it impossible for things to be done in the US itself, right? So we would really appreciate if the United States would just keep quiet, say, you understand we have problems, but please, the rest of you, go ahead and do as much as you can. And when the time is right, we really do believe that the United States, with its capacity and its ability and its resources, will be able to do a lot. But right now, it cannot. But what do we hear? We hear the United States saying publicly that we are ready, we are prepared for something that's more comprehensive as long as the major emitters come on board. Frankly, if today, developing countries, the bigger developing countries say, yes, we are willing to start negotiating a new treaty, the United States will not be able to join that boat, for sure. Right?
Why do you think it is that developing countries haven't called their bluff?
I think privately they do. I mean, from our conversations with many of the negotiators from many developing countries, because there have been a lot of meetings among ministers, throughout the year, in between. There's a lot of political meetings and all that. And as far as we understand, some of these very frank discussions have taken place between some developing countries and the EU, with the United States, and it's been actually said informally. Now, whether or not they're going to call the bluff publicly, I don't know. Those are decisions of governments. That's why as NGOs, as civil society groups, many of us keep pushing. Listen, don't keep saying, why is China not doing this? Why is India not doing this? Why don't we just ask the United States to keep quiet and leave us alone so that we can all work better? Why don't we push the EU to say, look, instead of supporting the ship jumping into a pledge and review, and that's what the United States did in Copenhagen and then in Cancun, the United States pledged, means we make it voluntary. Developed countries, we will volunteer as much as we can do, and then we'll send you some reports, and that is really not acceptable. So we want to see the existing two treaties with its obligations that everybody says they respect. Implement that.
Given that's unlikely, how do you see the next few days playing out?
I think a lot depends on, one of the interesting things about where we stand now in Durban is that countries like China, I live in China, and if you are governing 1.3 billion people, you have still 128 million people who are living below $1 a day. So because it's such a huge country, and yes, in the last 10 years, China's economy has grown, because if you do organize yourself, you are going to grow. You should be developing. And that means that in total numbers, the high growth rate, the economic growth has been big in total numbers. But if you go by per capita, the GDP of China is still in the list of the countries of the world, something in the 90s, right? And in terms of human development, the United States is number 4. And China is around 80-something. Right? And then, so if you look at it from that perspective, China is still very much a developing country. But they are very pragmatic. I was at the meeting of NGOs with the minister, the Chinese minister, a few days ago. And he said that the development so far of China has been expensive and unsustainable. And with our big population and our hopes to, really take people out of poverty and to develop, we will need to go low carbon. We will need to go on a very green pathway. And they know that. They know they need to do that. And so they have a 5-year development plan that was launched this year, because every 5 years they have a development plan that actually has been passed by their National People's Congress, So it's legally binding for them at home. And they've incorporated the 40% reduction of emissions target. The intensity, the energy efficiency target of 40%. That is now incorporated into the 5-year plan. So sector by sector, mitigation, adaptation, they are going to do amazing work. And it's going to be very difficult. And nobody's going to give them money to do it. They're going to do it themselves, right? So when people say China is not doing enough, frankly, independent studies, we're not talking about Chinese studies or Chinese political claims, they're saying that this one country is probably doing more in mitigation and they will do in adaptation than any other country in the world, including the developed countries. So what is the contribution at the international level? China is saying we have all these agreements that we've made, not only in the treaty, but Bali Action Plan, the agreement that we will have a second commitment period, we will set up the new fund, and developing countries will do more. We are willing to have all these transparency rules. That's what they are negotiating here. But it's very disheartening when you see, and I live in a developing country, I'm from Malaysia, we will have no choice. From the point of view of being impacted by climate change, whether people give us money or not, we will have to do something. But the point is, how do you help us to do it faster, better, so that we all really can collectively achieve more? And countries like China will do more. They're not going to be fighting with the African countries or the small islands for money that doesn't exist, but they are fighting for the fund because they believe that that fund is something that should exist internationally. And they are also doing South-South, but we need to have the developed countries meet their promises. So we see so far in the last 3 or 4 years, the developed countries are really ratcheting down their obligations. They're the ones who are in non-compliance, and they're breaking their promises. At the same time, developing countries are doing more because they want to contribute. But if we don't see good faith, if we don't see developing countries taking the lead as they agreed to do under these treaties, my fear is that many developing countries will get disillusioned, skeptical, and some will do as much as they can, but others may just say we just can't.
Yoke Ling, thank you for speaking to us.